Well, welcome back to our third and final session of Healing the Traumatized Brain Symposium. And I just want to say thank you to all of the presenters so far. And of course, our final presenter, I'm sure will be blessed again. Thank you, David, for introducing us to the mechanisms of trauma last night and giving us some healthy options to work through some of that. Appreciated that. And also this afternoon with the abuse in the church, just enlightening and empowering to know that there are things that we can do when we encounter these terrible events in our life. And now I want to bring up our next and final speaker, and we're going to ask Shannon to come and speak to us about children and warning signs. But before that, I just want to share a little bit about her. Shannon Vega has over 20 years, wow, praise the Lord, of experience in the mental health field, beginning with at-risk youth. She created and implemented programs for treatment level youth ages 3 to 17. She served as the Interim Executive Director at a group home for young, homeless, and pregnant women. She is trained and certified in CBT Plus for trauma, anxiety, depression, and for children who have Autism Spectrum Disorder with trauma. And today she'll be talking to us about the warning signs through the developmental stages and how to respond. Please. And before I forget, short-term memory. David and Jennifer will be up here. There's going to be a mock interview that will take place later in the presentation. So when you see them up here, that's why.
Thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you all for sticking this out for 3 whole sessions. That's a lot of trauma for all of us to go through together. We're going to be trauma bonded by the end of it. So today I'm going to be talking to you about children and teens, the warning signs of trauma, and some interventions to help them out, and all the things that go with that. And I have my lovely parents here that are going to get some therapy right here on stage and learn some interventions. And so we'll just jump right in. So I wanted to first let you guys know just how important children are to me. And so here's a few little quotes up here. Nelson Mandela said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children," which I think is very powerful. And for those of you that are familiar with Jordan B. Peterson, who is a psychologist in Canada and all over YouTube, he says, "Little children pay you back immensely if you have a good relationship with them, if you encourage them, and if you're on their side." Sorry, I skipped ahead. And here's a few more quotes that you guys might be familiar with that accentuate the importance of children. I love the first one when we talk about God created man in his own image, because we were all born, which means we were all created in his own image. And when we're children, as Dr. Schwerscher told us, we're very, very vulnerable. And why wouldn't we want to protect something that is in our own creator's image while it is vulnerable? And I love Psalms 139 as he talks about how we were formed and he knew us before we were born and how intricately we were woven. And I think that's just very precious. So before I get into any more, I have some people that have walked into my office, and I think they have questions for me.
We do. Well, am I on? You can hear me? Well, I am 6 months pregnant.
Congratulations.
Not in reality. So I'm 6 months pregnant here, and we want to know what we can do to start connecting with the child now. We've learned so much about what children, how they start developing in the womb and all these other things, and it seems like we should be doing something, but we don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I'm so glad you asked, because children are learning before they're even born. And you said you're about 6 months. This is wonderful. Did you know that your baby could already begin to hear your heartbeat when you were 18 weeks pregnant?
What?
I know. And then at 22 to 24 weeks, your baby could start to hear noises outside the womb, like dad. And you know, at about 6 months, right where you are, your baby can respond to what you're saying, which I think
Wow.
is fantastic because I believe that's about how old baby Jesus or John was when Mary went to visit Elizabeth, and Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, and the baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy."
So I should start talking to the baby
All
and
the
maybe
time.
have the dad start talking to the baby as well.
Right, and it's important how you talk to your baby and the conversations you have. And the conversations you allow to be had around you and the tones of voice, because the best intervention we can have for any of our children is prevention. It starts in the womb and it continues to infancy, because what we say and how we say it matters. So when you talk to David, even when you're a little grumpy with him, be kind.
Never happens.
Never, never. And once your baby is born, it's so miraculous, because at about 6 months old, out of the womb, they can begin to mimic and mirror what you say. Well, that's even at days old, not even 6 months old. And so if you're grumpy face, what's your baby gonna do?
Yeah.
Nobody likes that baby. We want the smiling baby. And at 12 months, they can understand you giving them simple commands. So even though they can't verbalize, they can, go get your shoes. They might still say no, not quite at 12 months, but soon.
All right. So we have one on the way, but we also have other children, and so we want to understand, like, what should we be expecting as they go through these different stages of development?
Lots of loss of sleep. Right, and I love that you mentioned the stages of development, because Erik Erikson is famous for, who knows, the 8 stages of development. Now, his stages go well into adulthood, but we only need to talk about 6, because you don't have like 40-year-olds that you're raising, right? Maybe it feels that way. Okay, so we're only going to go over 6 today. And that first stage is a little bit of what we were just talking about, that 0 to 12 month stage, and that's when they're developing trust versus mistrust.
So they can start trusting even in the womb by the way we talk.
Yes.
And that'll come out when they're, up to a year old.
Right. So tending to your baby's needs is really important. And what form of communication do our babies have?
Screaming.
Just their voice, right? And they have no words. It is screaming. And what do they cry for? They're
Everything.
hungry, right? They're tired. They need comfort. Maybe they're just scared. They don't know what that sound is. I've never heard it before. I'm brand new. So when we communicate with them like that, when we tend to every need on the spot like that, we're not spoiling them. We're making them trust us. When we don't respond, they don't trust us. And some of the things to look out for, if maybe your baby or you've met other people's babies and they don't seem right, is if they're not doing that mimic response. If you're doing, like, ooh, and they're turning away. That's a sad sign if your baby is not responding to you, or somebody else's baby is not responding to you. And if they're really, really soiled and you didn't know because they didn't cry, or you realize it's been a really long time since they've eaten, and why didn't they tell me? Because they learned their voice doesn't matter.
So it's actually a healthy thing when our children are crying and they do signal to us that they actually need us.
Yes, you can't spoil a baby. I don't care what anybody says. Okay, and then after 12 months old, we enter into our toddler years, and that's when we're developing autonomy versus shame and doubt, and that's our 1 to 3-year-olds.
Yeah, so we have a 2-year-old. So what are some things that we should be looking out for our 2-year-old?
Yeah, the toddlers are great. This is my favorite age. Like, okay, 9 months to 18 months, my favorite age, because they don't have a whole lot of language yet, but they can do so much and they learn so much. They're constantly exploring. That's why you're saying, get out of that, in your soft, calm voice, not your shaming voice. Don't do that. We say that all the time, right? They have to feel safe in their exploration. So there has to be a spot where they can explore safely, and then to know their boundaries where they cannot. So they need to be allowed to do most anything within reason by themselves, so they can learn from their own mistakes. So I love all you hover moms out there. I was one once too, and we do this at the playground, right? We're so worried. And then what are we doing? We're teaching them that whatever they're about to do is dangerous. We don't mean to, but that's what we're doing. And so we say, okay, you can go up the slide, and we hold them. There's no room for them to grow or learn their limitations when we do that. So allowing them to do that, let them get hurt. It's okay. They won't, I mean, babies are Rubbermaid anyway. If you've had one, they just bounce right back. Not too much hurt, of course, but hurt enough to know their limits. But when we say things like, oh, just let me do it, it'll be faster, we're teaching them they're not fast enough. When we say things like, I don't know, I'm sure you guys all know what I'm talking about. Oh, my favorite, we've all seen Finding Nemo. You think you can do these things, but you can't. Yeah. So we unintentionally shame them when we're doing that. And what it looks like if a child has been traumatized or abused at this age is, well, I'll tell you a little story. I once know this little foster girl. She was adorable. She was 2.5 months, or 2.5 years old, crazy curly hair, just the cutest thing, very articulate, could speak full sentences at 2.5 years old. She seemed sweet until we got her home. She had had a really rough upbringing for 2.5 years. And so she wasn't sure what she could do, what she couldn't do. She wasn't sure when her next meal was going to be. She wasn't sure what she was going to wear, who was going to watch her, who was going to hurt her, who was going to help her. So when she was in the home, she created chaos everywhere she went. So that meant she could just be sitting there silently, and everybody else would be doing their own thing. And out of nowhere, she would say, "Someone just hit me." Did a ghost hit you? Nobody is here. And what we learned is that she felt so out of control because there was no chaos in her life at that time that she had to create the chaos to know that nobody was going to come at her. She was directing it. So that's what it can look like when a child is not able to be autonomous and safe. They enter into shame and doubt, and they create their own chaos.
That sounds a lot like one of my friends. They have this 5-year-old, and I don't know what their deal is with guilt. It seems like they don't really feel guilt like they should when they make bad decisions. What can we expect from a 5-year-old?
Yeah. I love 5-year-olds. I love all children, if you can't tell. 5-year-olds are the greatest because they are the only 5-year-old on the planet. If you have ever met a 5-year-old, they are the only 5-year-old that exists. It's pretty awesome to see. Even when all their friends are 5, they're the only ones. So at this age, they're preschoolers, right? And they're getting into initiative versus guilt, more exploring, right? They're very interested in exploring, and they know a lot of what they can do, and they know a lot of what they shouldn't do. That's fun. So when we meet them with criticism and control, they do feel guilty, but that's the wrong kind of guilt, right? So if we're saying, well, why are you doing it that way? We're unintentionally guilting them. We're criticizing them, right? A big clue that something is wrong at this age, at 3 to 5 years of age, is they don't know the answer to the "what do you want to be when you grow up?" question. A 5-year-old should absolutely know what he wants to be when he grows up. And it's usually something really noble or exciting, right? I'm going to be the president of the United States. I'm going to be a NASCAR driver. Or more often these days, it's I'm going to be a famous YouTuber. But they know when it's something amazing. If your 5-year-old doesn't know, we should be a little bit worried. And children who don't share their opinions have most likely been criticized or dismissed often. Why do you like those shoes? That would make anybody feel bad, but imagine a little 5-year-old, right? So it's okay, though, because we can fix this. Kids are always playing. But first we see it bad in the play, right? This sort of guilt comes out in play, and you see things like, "You're a bad baby, go to the corner," and they smack their doll. Or, "You did this bad thing, you get a spanking," and it's a normal preschooler thing. But that's okay because we can also play with them to fix these things.
So at this age, it's kind of like where they're trying to figure out the difference between, like, maybe there's something I did that wasn't effective versus I'm like a bad kid. And we
Right.
want to try to help them recognize if something is effective without making them feel like they're a bad person.
And it's okay if it's not effective,
Right.
because we're going to teach you how to make it effective. right? I tell everybody, all kids of all ages, even, the 99-year-olds, I love failing. And we should teach our kids that it's okay to fail too, because when I fail, I know what I did wrong. And I can do it better next time. Every time we fail, we learn something about ourselves, no matter what it's about. So yes, teaching them the difference between all that.
Well, we also have a 9-year-old, and yeah, we're trying to figure out, okay, at that stage, what should we be expecting?
Mean girls. Fourth, fifth grade, I don't know why, for some reason, girls, they turn into mean girls. Sorry if any of you are in here. It's because they're learning what hill to fight on. So they're going to fight every hill. They're going to die on them all because they're trying to figure out what am I fighting for, right? But really what we don't want to see is children who don't handle constructive criticism well at this age, right? So before we were teaching them, it's okay if you mess up. Now we want to say, okay, you messed up, and you're also going to fix it. And I'm going to guide you in that, and that's okay. But if they can't handle that, then probably they had a hard time in that stage before this. So a child who is feeling inferior is going to be really quiet. Maybe he's going to act out. He's not going to be building relationships. He's not going to be talking about serious things. He's going to have really surface level conversations at this point. You guys remember the little foster girl I was just talking about? She also had 2 older brothers. They didn't get to stay together. They were separated, which is the worst thing when there's foster siblings. So the little girl was given a loving home and a family, and the 2 older boys were put in a home for boys where there wasn't a mom, there were just rules, and there were tasks, and there was a mean house mom. And one of the brothers was about 6, 7 years old, and the mean house mom always criticized them, always told them they were bad, never talked to them in a loving tone, and would even go so far as if she felt something was very arbitrarily bad, the child was to sleep on the floor next to his bed. Right? So he, of course, was wanting attention from anywhere and would act out to get it. And he would play the part that he was told he was to get the attention, if that makes sense. But one thing that I've seen really to be helpful in my practice and in my personal life is when a child has entered into that inferiority at this stage, there's something that we can do to help them. You give them a job, you give them ownership over something. And it has to be like a really big project, but something they're really excited about. So if they love animals and you have animals, you say, you're going to build a cat house for the cat. That's your job. You get to do it however you want. You get to ask for help when you want it. Or maybe they're a writer and they like to write poetry. Your job is to write a poem for the next family gathering, or a song, or a skit. But you give them something that they have ownership over, and the parents' hands are out of it unless they ask. And they get to make all the mistakes they want, and you get to be as supportive as ever.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the foster child, because actually we're looking into fostering a child that's 16.
God bless you.
And we have no idea what to expect. Teens, it just seems like it's an emotional roller coaster, and, they're passionate about this one day and then something else the other day, and we just don't know what to expect.
Yeah. And it's also hard when you're fostering because sometimes you get to get the family history and sometimes you get to guess. And sometimes they're open enough to tell you. So in this stage, and I just don't envy anybody who is in this age range right now, ever at all. If I meet somebody who is in this age range, I want to cry for you. It is really, really hard to be a teenager right now. I used to cry for the parents, but there's just so much influence coming in, right? So this is identity versus identity confusion. And this is where identity crisis thoughts come in. And these are the thoughts of, I don't fit in, I'm unloved, nobody gets me. Media is telling me to be my true self. Does anybody know who their true self is at 13? Oh my goodness. So an identity crisis can happen if one has been left to feel inferior in that previous stage. When young people are overwhelmed with responsibility and expectations, they can't find their identity. So that's what we're looking at with your 16-year-old. We want them to have responsibility and expectations. Don't get me wrong, those are very important. The operative word here is overwhelmed. How do you know when somebody's overwhelmed? What are the signs of that? You know, we cry, we shake, we say bad things, we throw things, right? There's a lot of frustration. And what is one thing we do as parents? I see this especially with homework, right? The kid's getting overwhelmed and we're like, just do the problem, right? And like, you can. That's what overwhelmed looks like. We're both overwhelmed. The kid is crying, the parent is yelling. That's overwhelmed. Yes, expect them to do more. But even professional bodybuilders, they take breaks, right? They push themselves to the limit. They lift like 5,000 pounds over their head successfully and they drop it and they walk away. Their bodies can't handle anymore. They know their limit. So it's our job to understand your 16-year-old's limits, see when they're overwhelmed, and encourage them to do things and be able to have these open, respectful conversations with a teenager. No, they don't have all the answers. They think they do. So let them say their case. We have some very intelligent youth in the world right now. Let them speak and then tell them you're the parent.
Well, we also have an adult child now. 19 years old, has left the home. So what should we be expecting at that stage when they're launching out?
Oh, a lot of things, but so this next stage is intimacy versus isolation, and this goes all the way up to age 40, but obviously I'm only talking about up to the mid-20s ish. I know that legally they're adults at 18, but who was an adult at 18? Who's older than 18 right now? Our brain isn't even fully developed until we're in our mid to late 20s, and that's at best. So we can't expect our adults to be adults. So children who are not raised with boundaries become young adults who don't feel loved. So the best thing you can do for your now adult child is to give them boundaries and a lot of love. And I stole this phrase from my husband, so I'll give him credit for this. No means I love you. Right? We're not just letting them roam the earth freely. And we're not mean when we say no. We love them, right? So children know that even if they don't like the rules, they are there to keep them safe. And that lets them know they're loved. A phrase I often hear from older teens in my office who've never had boundaries, often those foster kids they've just been left to run freely. I ask them, well, do you think that you could do this youth group thing on Wednesday nights? Would your parents be okay with that? They don't care what I do. I can do whatever I want. They don't care. And then I ask this question. How loved do you feel in your home? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very loved and 10 being the most loved. They tell me 0. So no means I love you. And sometimes that respectful conversation I was talking about before, sometimes let them state their case, right? Hey, Mom, I got good grades. I'm doing well in college. I always put gas in the tank. I've got my own money. Can I go kind of just drive around with these 3 friends you've never met before? Tell me why you think that's a good idea, son. This is your respectful conversation. Let them know their place and know that they're heard. Well, Mom, I'm really responsible. You know what? You're right. 100% right. And I also do not know the character of these 3 people you're trying to put in your car. I don't know their families, and I don't know them. So until there's a minimum amount of time spent together, the answer is no, because I love you. Yeah. So those are the 8 stages. Any more questions about all that?
Well, actually, our other question was about the 16-year-old that we're thinking about having as a foster child. We're not sure if this child may have trauma. So what would be some signs that we should be looking for that can indicate to us whether or not they've experienced some kind of trauma?
Yeah, great question. So sleep disturbance, I know we saw that a lot in our foster daughter. She had night terrors. It was awful. Headaches, unexplained pain. We should not have 8-year-olds saying their back hurts. What are you talking about? oversensitivity to touch and sound, right? Ah, it's too loud, it's too bright, and like the lights are dim. Shutting down, agitated, lack of concentration and attention, self-harming behavior. And that's not just, what we all know is cutting, but there's picking, there's head banging, there's all kinds of ways that self-harming behavior can come out. Dopamine seeking activities. You guys know what that is? The lovely little saying, retail therapy. Yes, that's dopamine. So spending lots of money, promiscuity, these are all dopamine seeking activities. Difficulties with language processing and fine motor skills, so those delayed behaviors. Acting clingy and needy, and I'm going to pause here for a second because sometimes children will even act clingy and needy, as Dr. Schwerscher said and David said, to the person that abused them. So if you do know their story and maybe their perpetrator is their family member, during visits you see snuggling, that's a sign of it's a warning sign of trauma. Self-loathing thoughts and comments, and our previous presenters mentioned some of those too. I'm stupid, nobody loves me, I'm just going to mess it up anyway.
So how do you tell the difference between someone who's cuddling with a family member in a healthy way versus an unhealthy way?
Yeah, that can be tough. That can be tough, and you're going to have a lot of discernment there, and some of it's obvious. Right? It's fine to see a 2 or a 3-year-old curl up in mom's lap and snuggle in, right? Or if they're doing it because they think they're supposed to. So it's a lot of observing, right?
Gotcha. So I think I may have seen these in other families. What do I do if I see some of these red flags?
Oh, yeah, that's the question, right? And as previous speakers have said, we don't want to just jump the gun and accuse everybody of being a terrible, awful person. So we can ask questions, we can explore more, and we can love them ourselves, and we can encourage their parents to love them. One of the best interventions is safe touch and physical reassurance. That gives the right kind of love. That gives the right kind of dopamine, the right kind of oxytocin, and all that when they know it's coming from a safe person, and it makes them feel safe, protected, and in control. And then one more thing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, is be a trauma-informed parent, which is something I think I made up, but maybe I didn't. And we'll talk about that soon. But also something that we need to do, especially with your foster children, is rules. Rules are good, right? Remember, no means I love you. And rules should be posted in the house. No matter how old your kids are, rules are a living document, and they mature as we mature, right? And it's cool to have them right there and have some rules that also apply to the parents, because kids love to keep us in check. It makes it really fun for them. So if the rule is no cell phones at the table and mom pulls out her cell phone to check her emails real quick, mom, you're right, right? It holds everybody accountable. And house rules vary from home to home, right? You might have a worship time that should go on your rules, not necessarily rules, but you can call them guidelines at this time. Remember, this is a living document. So a little bit more about rules. We don't want to be overly punitive, and we don't want to micromanage. So we want the minimum necessary rules with the minimum, say that 3 times fast, necessary force. And I stole those phrases from Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, because he likes to say things repeatedly too. So, so I'm not telling you to let your kids run wild, but what I'm saying is make it simple. We're not going to say, like the hover mom when they're 2. So the older version of that is, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, remember to do that, remember to do that, remember. I'm already overwhelmed. That's too much, right? So we want rules that are umbrellas. They're general rules that apply to a lot of things, right? So be respectful. That just covers like 5 rules right there. Don't yell, don't talk back, right? All the things that be respectful, that's a rule. And it covers no cursing, right? Family dinner at the table, if that's a rule, that covers a lot of things. That means actually you need to be at the table at 5, which means everything else you're doing before that is done. Very easy, right? The expectation is there. You guys get the picture. So when But then there's other rules. There's not just the posted rules. We still have to guide our children in the moment, right? We can't just be like, oh, it's not on the rule board, so I guess this is okay. No. So in the moment, we have to guide them. So imagine, let's go back to that 3 to 5-year-old stage. They love to explore, right? We talked about that. Do your kids like to climb on things they're not supposed to climb on?
Yes.
Yes. Right? And so we say to them, don't jump on the couch. And the next day they start jumping on the couch and we say, you know better. No, they don't. They knew that it wasn't okay yesterday. Is it still not okay today? Yes. So we be consistent. That's part of having good boundaries and good rules. And then we say things like, keep your feet on the ground, not don't jump on the couch. Because now we have to think about that. If I yell, don't run, what did you hear me say? Run. You heard me say run. I don't know what other options there are. Right? Walk. Use your walking feet in the house. First of all, it makes them have to think about a lot more words. So they go and they look around and then they're walking anyway and they don't realize they're following their directions. It's fantastic.
So you don't tell them don't, you tell them do.
You tell them do. Don't tell them what not to do. You tell them what to do, right? It's not don't climb. It's keep your feet on the ground. It's not stop talking. It's please be quiet. Oh, and I use good manners with my children and with the children I work with because we want them to use them with us, right? So it's not listen to me because I said so, which is true, by the way. Respect your parents no matter what, even if they don't use nice words. But we can't teach them if we're not modeling it, right? So please listen to me. I've asked you to clean your room. Thank you.
Well, as we've been considering doing foster care, we've noticed that there can be different types of things that they can go through. So maybe the kiddo wasn't fed as much when they were there. And other times, maybe there's been things that have been more egregious, like maybe they experience physical abuse. Is there a difference between these types of actions that happens against them, and how can we kind of distinguish those?
Yeah, so we have we're going to go back to elementary school. We have capital letters and we have little letters. So there's big T trauma and there's little t trauma, right? And when we talk about big T trauma, I'm not going to go too much into trauma because my 2 predecessors did an amazing job telling you guys what it is. But when we talk about big T trauma, this is usually like those violent acts, those aggressive acts. That's what we're referring to. And when we talk about little T trauma, these are the things that were not violent, but maybe grandma died last week and that was really hard. And it's more of those chronic things, right? So it's not, I was in a car accident yesterday. It's, I've been told 25 times today that I'm stupid. That can wear on a person, right? So they don't seem like big ticket items, but they are. And that's not to discount anybody's trauma or that big T is worse than little t. It's just to distinguish between them because they all cause significant distress. Oh, and then also, you guys have heard a lot about ACEs, wow, I almost said adaptive, adverse childhood experiences, right? And those are those 10 questions that kind of lend to whether or not you will end up with a diagnosis of PTSD, most likely. But we also have what's called our benevolent childhood experiences or our counter ACEs. And it is also a list of 10 questions. I don't have them listed here, but they are predictors of resilience. So you might hit every single one of those questions on that list and be feeling really, really hopeless. But you might also hit every single one of those questions on the counter ACEs, I'll call them. And those are a really good indicator that you're going to get through this okay. And those are all, not all of them, but most of them are about social support. So one of the key indicators that you can go through something really terrible and be okay is that you had an adult in your life when you were a child that was not part of your nuclear family. So it's not mom or dad, it's not somebody you live with, but it's somebody outside your family that took a genuine interest in you and gave you unconditional positive regard. Right? So it could be a teacher, it could be a neighbor down the street. I remember this really cool couple, like 2 doors down from me. They didn't have kids. I don't know their story. I think they probably couldn't have kids. They were always inviting me over to do crafts with them and pick tomatoes out of their garden. And I felt so loved by them. I can't even remember their names, but that lent to my resilience. So so build your village is what I'm saying, because we're not perfect. We're going to do some things that are going to mess up our kids. I hope not, but probably build your village so your kids have somebody to rely on and something to remember. Also having routine.
So what if for us as parents, what if we've had experiences where maybe we've experienced some of our own traumas, or maybe we have some of those ACEs? Like, when is the best time to maybe address that as parents?
Yesterday. Yeah, so we learned a little bit about betrayal trauma, right? And so, in my very humble opinion, I think the best prevention for creating betrayal trauma in your own home as a parent to your own children is to be a trauma-informed parent. So know your baggage. Know you know what, maybe my childhood wasn't the greatest, but it might be a reason why I get activated sometimes, but it's not an excuse to act bad to my kids. So we've all had bad things happen to us. It's a broken world. Nobody is perfect, and nobody has not had something terrible happen. And parents with unresolved trauma have to learn how to navigate protecting their children, and sometimes that even means protecting them from themselves. And the best way to do that is to be aware of our own trauma and how it affects them and how we discipline them. So to recognize your own personal trauma, no matter what size T it is, well, let me tell you a story. There was this girl, this was back before I was in my clinical work. I was working in the home and in the community, and I was tasked with the job of helping this family with a 16-year-old girl. And she was having just really bad behaviors in school, in the home, a lot of defiance, a lot of rudeness. I'm not coming home. I'm not going to school. I'm not doing anything, and there's no consequence that's going to make me do anything. So I'm supposed to rush in with my cape and fix all of this, right? So the names have been changed to protect the innocent. So I met with the mom, who we'll call Frankie, and she told me all these terrible behaviors that her 16-year-old daughter, Savannah, was having. And then she said, and she loves to be hugged, and I can't do it. I've been abused so many times as a child up into adulthood, and when my child comes to me for a hug, I instantly push her away. And it's not just oh, not now, honey. It is a knee-jerk reaction because I cannot be touched, because I'm instantly, like David told us yesterday, I'm living my trauma. It is what happened inside of me. And every time my child touches me, I can't respond in love. She didn't articulate it that well, but that's what she said. And so what happens is, when Savannah was 3 to 5 years old, and she came to get comfort from mom, and mom did this, Savannah cried, and then mom said, "What are you crying about?" Which didn't help. And then Savannah felt guilt and shame and isolation, and all she wanted was a hug. So where do 16-year-old girls get hugs when they can't get them at home? Yeah. So Savannah was disobedient because there were boys at the park, and they gave her what she wanted. So that lack of affection turned into her seeking other things that would make her feel loved. So for Frankie, her job was to heal herself, because that unresolved trauma, and reliving your trauma every day as a parent, is creating that betrayal trauma. I'm going to act bad to my kid, and then I'm going to give him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So know your stuff and get help as soon as you can, as soon as you recognize it. And so for some of us, it's maintenance. You might have gone through some terrible things as a child, and then gone and done your work, and I'm ready to have kids. Kids are full of surprises. And then they do something, and you're instantly back in your trauma, and you're thinking, I thought I took care of this. I thought I was a trauma-informed parent. I thought I was doing this right. It's okay. It's okay. It just means something else came up, and you need to call David, or no, you can call me too. So your past as a parent is not your child's future. A child who is yelled at and beaten, then grows up without healing to have children of their own, is less capable of parenting in a compassionate way. A person who lives in a way that they continue to organize their life as if the trauma were still going on and every new experience is contaminated by the past, is not healed from their past. Okay.
Well, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about this family trauma and how this can play out.
Yeah. Yeah, so to talk a little bit more about what that unresolved trauma looks like, and some statistics you guys have already heard, but can't hear too often, I think, is people who are not recovered from their trauma. So you can do your self-inventory for yourself now. We were inventorying others, but now as a parent, we're inventorying ourselves so that we can do good for our kids. You might, or parents might, experience things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune diseases. And Bessel van der Kolk, who David also referenced, tells us in his book, The Trauma Keeps the Score, that when one has brain damage due to war, a car accident, domestic violence, or even an aging brain due to dementia, those are a lot of big T items, we become creatures of habit. So what that means is, as adults, not just children in an identity crisis, relationships become superficial, which means discovery and wonder are lacking, which means you can't do that for your kid if it's lacking in you. Since they're full of wonder, we need to be able to meet them there, so we need to fix that trauma ourselves. So when Frankie is reliving her trauma every time Savannah touches her, this can be worse than her original trauma, and then she's creating more trauma with her own child. Some statistics real quick about young girls who watch their mothers get abused. They're far more likely to be in an abusive relationship themselves. Women who had an early history of abuse and neglect are 7 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in adulthood. So this is why being a trauma-informed parent is important. This is because their danger radar has been broken at their first trauma. So their emergency response system, that fight, freeze, fawn we just learned about, it's overridden by their original abuser, and now they're incapable of detecting what is harmful and also unable to determine what is safe and nourishing, which means I might think that my abuser is super safe and nourishing, as David pointed out yesterday, but this nice man who's trying to help me with my homework is dangerous, right? Sometimes when we're presented with trauma, with stress, we shut down or we become excessively angry. I don't know any adults like that. This creates a failure to be in touch with your own body. It results in a lack of self-protection, and it increases re-victimization. Research suggests that children with mothers diagnosed with PTSD were 6 times more likely to have emotional problems and 11 times more likely to be hyperaggressive. Hostile mothers are more likely to have had an abusive upbringing. These studies indicate that children raised by hostile mothers as adults had an unstable sense of self. They were impulsive to the point it was self-damaging. Some of these impulses were poor spending and poor basic life choices. And for most children who have been abused, it is safer to hate themselves than it is to risk the relationship with their parent, which is why they're snuggling at visits, by acting out or expressing anger. These children believe that at their core, they are unlovable, and that is the only way they can comprehend how and why they were treated so poorly.
So it seems like there's a lot of traumas that can happen. Are there also traumas that can happen within the family context?
Absolutely. So there are family trauma. Even if you are super healed, you did it all right? You all did your therapy, you manage, you maintain. Things happen. Bad things happen sometimes, right? Parents get divorced. We don't want that, but it happens. Sometimes one or both parents experiences substance use. Sometimes a family member becomes terminally or chronically ill. A sudden loss of a family member other than divorce. And the biggest one, and I'll give that its own attention, is having no father in the home. So yeah, when we get stressed as a family, life squeezes us and we have to make choices. Life is hard, and sometimes being a trauma-informed parent means knowing when your family is in crisis. Parents constantly fighting in front of their kids is extremely traumatizing to the kids. So calling each other's names to each other's faces or even behind each other's backs when the children can hear, that's pretty abusive. It seems like it's not, but children are inherently loyal to both of their parents. So when I'm saying, your dad is a this and a that, that kid's saying, but that's my dad, and he taught me how to ride a bike, and you're my mom, and you hold me when I cry.
Mm-hmm.
That's some serious mental gymnastics for a kid to have to go through, and it's not fair to them. So my best recommendation when things have gone bad like this is, number one, repent, take responsibility, and sometimes that means taking responsibility to your kids too. And then you choose to do different, and you show them what different and better looks like, right? Remember that failure thing? I'm great at it, and I learned a lot. So be honest with them as age appropriately as possible, and choose not to fight in front of them, and make sure you make up in front of them if you do fight in front of them. And always apologize to them so it teaches them humility.
So it sounds like modeling this stuff is really helpful for kids. Then if we can repair it, sometimes the repair can be reparative for them as well.
Absolutely.
So what about like this whole issue of fatherlessness? Because I know that amongst the friends that I had growing up, a lot of us didn't have our dads around, and some of us didn't meet our dads until we were adults. And so what should we be expecting if a child goes through that and doesn't have a father around?
Yeah. So these are just the statistics, and they are sad. They are sad, but they don't have to be the reality for your child. If for whatever reason you've done your best and there's no dad and it's not your fault. I am a fatherless child, and I'm up here speaking to you with 20 years experience in the mental health field. And I mean, I seem pretty okay, right? So there's hope. So I don't want you guys to think it's all gloom and doom. But yeah, the United States has the highest rate of children in single-parent households of the nation in the entire world. There are over 18 million fatherless children in the U.S. And absent fathers are absent from approximately 80% of single-parent homes. Fatherless families are more likely to live in poverty. They're more likely to abuse drugs, show signs of delinquent behavior. 66% of children in juvenile detention are fatherless. 20% have never lived with their father at all, and 25% had alcoholic fathers. So some data suggests that 72% of adolescent murderers and 70% of long-term prison inmates came from fatherless homes. This is huge. We need our dads. We need our moms too. And little girls need their dads just as much as little boys need their dads. Because dads don't just teach boys to be tough and how to build things, and they also teach little boys how to treat women. And dads teach little girls what to expect from men. So if my dad picks me up and he holds me and he tells me I'm the most beautiful princess in the whole wide world and I'm smart too, I'm not going to expect anything less from some guy who comes knocking on my door, right? But if I don't have a dad, well, if the guy just, burps and says, "Excuse me," that's enough, right? We need our dads. Fatherless children are more likely to die as children and live an average of 4 years less over a lifespan. But here's the good news. Children who feel a closeness to their father are twice as likely as those who do not enter college or find stable employment after high school. 75% less likely to have a teen birth, and 80% less likely to spend time in jail. 80% less likely to spend time in jail if you have a connection with your father. And half as likely to experience multiple depression symptoms. So the quality of the father-child relationship matters more than the specific amount of hours spent together. So even if you have one of those situations where they live in two homes, non-resident fathers can have positive effects on children's social and emotional well-being. High levels of father involvement are correlated with higher levels of social ability, confidence, and self-control in children. That's huge. You know what? Something else dads do, and it's not on my list, but I just thought of it. They play really rough with kids. Moms don't do that, right? And so if you have a little boy, especially, because boys are rough and tumble, but little girls too, if you have being raised by just a mom, not many of us are willing to wrestle and throw you in the air really high and like pin you down until you tap out, right? Teaching you your limits. Moms don't typically do that. And if you're a mom that does that, high five. Because I'm like, "Oh, you're hurting him." It's not hurting him. They need to wrestle. They need to say, "Ow." You need to make their little cheeks a little bit rosy so you can teach them their limits. And there's so much more research on this and so much more biology to it. But I'm going to botch this. But there's this thing in the brain that actually gets better connected when the dad throws the baby up in the air and catches him. And it has to be that much of a connection or that much of an impact for it to fully develop, right? Because us moms were like, oh, and that's sweet, but it's not doing the thing. And I'll have to look it up and put it in the YouTube questions because it's amazing. Like I said, I'm botching it. But father engagement reduces behavioral problems. And so that's why I say build your village, because it doesn't have to be, it's best if it's the father, but it doesn't have to be. There are many father figures in this community and all over the world that haven't even had biological children of their own, but are father to many. So build that community. Yeah. And I guess I talked too fast. That's okay. We have more time for questions. So I like to end with this. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. So let's treat them like that. Okay. Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
Many of you enjoyed the presentation. Couple of days before we wind up our session tonight, though, this afternoon. We want to check and see if there are any question cards out there. I see two in the hand of Keith. If you have a question card that you filled out, a question for our presenter, go ahead and raise that card up and we'll address those questions here in just a moment. All right. We can work with that. You want to come on up?
Yep.
All right. So first big question, where can I get the rules poster? I want to put our house rules.
Yeah, I actually recommend you make your own rules poster and you do it with your children. So this is bonding. It's your living document and you get to make them your literal house rules. So it doesn't have to be expensive. Go to Dollar Tree, get one of those big things, get a few of them, and that way you can make a lot of mistakes and learn from them. You get the markers and you guys decide what your rules are and what's going to work best for your family.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next question. What are the statistics shown on motherless homes? We just talked about fatherless homes. What about motherless homes?
Yeah, I don't have those off the top of my head, but absolutely mothers play a huge role in this. And I'd like to say that the statistics are just as bad as motherless homes. Being a mother myself, I'm a bit biased and a bit partial to mothers. However, I'm pretty sure that the research shows that the statistics are worse for fatherless homes than they are for motherless homes. Go figure.
Are there differences on autistic and traumatized children?
Yes and no. So just real quick, I'm not the expert on autism, but I do know a bit. So children with autism are, well, it's a spectrum. I think we all know that, right? So there's people with high levels of autism that are mute and can't use the restroom and have a very hard time communicating, and then there's high functioning where you wouldn't know, you just think that person's just a little off, right? So like nonverbal children in general, not even just with autism, they're going to be that really, they're going to sit back. They're going to be the wallflower. They're going to be kind of shut down. They're going to observe a lot. And then there's also the obvious things like they're going to flinch. They're not going to be sure. They're not going to understand what is safe and what isn't safe. Those of you familiar with autism know that the term ekalela, and that is where a child just kind of, or an adult, but I talk about children a lot, they just repeat a lot of what they heard. I worked with a young man. He was amazing. He was nonverbal when I met him. He was 9 years old, but he loved VeggieTales. And that's the only way he could communicate with me was through VeggieTales. And he would just repeat over and over again, "You're Jonah, you're Jonah." And that meant he was happy. Right, but when he wasn't happy, he did this funny little game with me, and he'd go, "I'm Jonah." which I think was his way of telling me, I need a little bit extra attention today. Right? So to shorten this a little bit, a lot of the symptoms and signs of trauma are going to be the same, and a lot of them are going to be, so if you have an 11-year-old child with autism, they might be developmentally 3 to 5 years old. So you're going to be looking for more of those 3 to 5-year-old symptoms rather than the symptoms for an 11-year-old, in a nutshell.
Thank you. All right, so scenarios. Daughter, age 15, quote, Dad, may I go roller skating with my friends tonight? Wednesday. And thinking, no, it's the middle of the week. Pause. Dad, we can do this the easy or the hard way, but I'm going roller skating.
Ooh.
How should I have responded?
Oh, you don't get to go roller skating for a month. No. So this is where your family rules come in, because this can be prevented, right? This is boundaries. And so we can stop this before it even happens, because we have a rule in our house that our children absolutely hate, and that's no screens during the week. So this reduces this power struggle of, hey, all my homework's done. I've done all my responsibilities. Can I play video games? What's the house rule? So having a house rule that says, we don't do things like that during the weekdays when their school is in session. Or the house rule is, yeah, you can do these things if all your chores are done, all your homework is done. I know the person in your home by 8. Do you still want to go?
All right. Next question. How do we identify love?
Oh, not the age-old question. How do I identify love? No, I'm kidding. To identify love is to observe it. I think we see love. I mean, as therapists, those of you that are counselors in the room, we observe a lot, and I know that I can tell as soon as a family walks in my office whether there's resentment or grace and understanding and forgiveness happening between them before they say a word. I can tell by how close they're sitting to each other, how they're sitting, how anxious their legs are, and how well they respond to each other once they start to talk. So how do you identify love? For me, it's warm hugs. I'm Olaf. I like warm hugs. Some of you might be familiar with the 5 love languages, right? So there's words of affirmation, acts of service, time spent together, physical affection, and gifts and surprises. I'm so proud of myself right now. Right, and all of us fall somewhere in these categories, right? And for me personally, I'm physical affection, and I want those words of affirmation. So to identify love is to identify how your family speaks to you. So if my husband's always giving me gifts, that's not really my love language, but I'm going to pay attention to that, and I'm going to guess he likes gifts. That's how I identify love. How do people speak to me? I have another friend who loves to do acts of service for me. Always doing things for me. It's not necessarily my love language, but I bet it's hers, and that's why I identify love.
We are going to give you the freedom to truncate your responses because you all have made up for the last 2 nights. The last 2 days, forgive me. At 11 months of age, our son ate a mushroom of unknown species. We lived in the African bush. What would you do? Notice. Getting to the medical facility was not possible. We had no Epicac. All I knew was to give him salt water. He refused. I used force from desperation. What traumatic signs should I look for, if any?
Some mushrooms?
Mushrooms of unknown species.
Right. So just for clarification, so there was force used to help the child from the distress.
Yeah.
And
He didn't want the salt water. He refused it, but
they forced
Yes.
it. Yeah, that can be traumatizing. And but I think what's good about the situation is that child definitely knows he's loved, because there was extreme measures taken to preserve his life. And I know at 11 months old, he doesn't identify that. He doesn't know that. All he knows is that you're the person that shoved something down my throat that I did not like, and now you're scary. And you might be scary to him for a while. That would be a sign that there's been trauma, that the person who had to do the forcing, now the kid shies away from or cries, or maybe he's having difficulty eating or drinking things because of what had to happen to him. And it was one of those necessary things, right? But the way to preserve that is to be consistent. Continue to be the hand that gives him the peanut butter jelly sandwich, not the forceful stuff, right? Continue to hold him, continue to love him. And even if he's pushing away, within reason, right? Remember that overwhelm thing I was talking about? It's okay, baby. It's just me. I'm not going to hurt you. Do you want to hold my hand instead? Right? Give him options.
Thank you. What are some of the benevolent childhood experiences?
Great question. Can I use my computer for that
Yes,
one? Let's escape. Now you guys get to see my ducks. I love my ducks. Okay, just go away. How do I make it go away? Whatever. It'll go away that way. Okay, so over here, I actually have a copy of the BCEs right there. Okay, so these questions are, like I said, grossly social supports, right? Did you have at least one caregiver whom you felt safe with? Do you have at least one good friend? Do you have beliefs that comfort you? That one's huge. It's one of the first questions I ask people when they walk in my office. Do you have a faith or belief that gives you comfort? Do you like school, or did you like school? Did you have at least one teacher who cared about you? Did you have good neighbors? Was there an adult, not a parent or caregiver, remember what I talked about, who could provide you with support or advice? And did you have opportunities to have a good time, right? Could you play? I've seen some parents that do this, they don't, and they're well-meaning, right? But they're like, ugh, no. They say no a lot to childhood behaviors that should be fostered. Let them play, right? Did you go places? Did you do things that were fun? Did you like yourself or feel comfortable with yourself? And did you have a predictable home routine? So those are your BCEs, your counter ACEs.
very good. Thank you. Question. Is it possible to engage in a healthy conflict management in front of the children and have it be a helpful modeling
Yes.
for resolving conflict?
100%. 100%. So you might have to learn that behind closed doors with a skilled therapist, right? Go to your marriage therapist. But you 100% can have these conflict resolution things without raising your voice, without name calling in front of your children. And it looks a lot like staying focused, no shaming, right? No blaming. And we're just saying, wow, you have not taken out the trash, and I feel really disrespected right now. How are we going to resolve that? Right? And if you're both healthy and you've done all your work with David, then you will know, oh, well, I feel very tired because I took out the trash 3 days in a row now, and I thought maybe it could be your turn. Well, that's fair, honey, but I'm also doing the dishes, so I feel that you could help me out, right? So these are just, that's what it looks like, but in more serious terms.
All right. Thank you. Question. What is the impact of yelling?
I think that is variable. We talk about frequency and duration a lot in therapy, right? So none of us are perfect. So if I get upset and I bite my husband's head off in front of my children, and I do that once a year, the kids are going to roll their eyes and they're going to go on with their day, and it's not going to be a problem. But if I'm yelling at him every single morning at 7:10 repeatedly for 3 months straight, my children are going to be a little shaky. They're going to lack concentration in school. They're not going to know if their home is stable, because it sure doesn't sound like it. So that's the spectrum there.
All right. Touching on the home, what is the role of a nanny when parents are very permissive?
Good question. So, I have a couple angles I want to go with this. One angle is, as the nanny, depending on your rapport with the parents and how much you trust them, could you encourage the parents to be a little less permissive, right? Can you say, hey, I think little Johnny would prefer if, right? Or I would feel more comfortable if. So there is, I mean, we're all adults at that point, right? The nanny is worried about the parenting, right? So we can have this dialogue, right? And I think the role of all nannies is to just love that child and be their biggest cheerleader, Because if there's a nanny in the home, that means the parents are probably pretty busy, whether it's for work or there's a health condition with another caregiver. We need that person.
Maybe it would be good to have that conversation even before you start working.
Yeah, yep. Prevention is the best intervention.
What happens to a person whose childhood trauma is not healed and they go into adulthood?
Yeah.
How, I'm going to say things, I think this is how does ACEs impact the life?
Yeah, and we talked about that a lot in the presentation. ACEs doesn't have to be the predictor, right? Because we also have the counter ACEs, the benevolent childhood experiences, right? So yes, you're more likely to experience PTSD symptoms if you have a lot of those ACEs, but they don't have to rule your entire being, right? So the more BCEs you have, right, the theory is the less impactful your trauma will be on your adulthood. So if you have a lot of those 10 that I rattled off, and you also have a lot of those 10 on the ACEs, not that they counter each other out, but they do make your odds better. So if you're a person who has 10 ACEs and only 1 BCE, you're gonna have to call somebody and do a lot of work. And the opposite, maybe you can get through it with some self-help books.
I might open up these next few questions to the others too. It sounds like it might pour into your areas. This one, if I am wrong about the way that I read this, it's your fault. It's like somebody took notes on a paper here, so I'm going to try to read it. If a family or a family member won't acknowledge or talk about sexual assault or betrayal trauma that may have happened in the home, or you're unsure if it happened because they believe secrets to protect the family name, where would a person take the next steps to heal?
Yeah, I think I'll let one of you guys take that. Is that one working?
Okay, so there's a lot of steps there. So I think one of the things, so sometimes it takes people a while before they're willing to open up about the fact that the trauma has happened, because it can be extremely embarrassing, or it can be very humiliating. There is something that's very exposing about acknowledging that something traumatic has happened to you. When I've worked with people, that's been something that they've really struggled with. It's like sometimes it can take years before they open up. The best thing to do is to provide a supportive environment, because readiness on the part of the person who's experienced this is critical. One of the elements that often happens with trauma is the person is left feeling as though they had no choice. And so I'm always very, very clear about, we don't want to force people to go into treatment. Now there are things you can do to help people feel more motivated to begin speaking about these things, and there are steps for that. And some of them are just identifying this acronym that we use with a style called motivational interviewing. And it's used the acronym DARN, D-A-R-N, and it's desires, abilities, reasons, and needs. And I try to identify how whatever is going on for them might be getting in the way of things they desire, how these things could be well within their abilities to handle, what reasons they would have to actually want to talk about this, and what needs are impacted by keeping this thing a secret. So that's usually what I would do with people, but I don't push anybody to begin talking about it before they're ready.
Dr. Schwartz?
Is the person is still at home living under the parents, are they a child, underage, or is this as an adult? That would be an important difference.
Not identified, just a family member. Family members.
So if they're a child, it's hard to know what to tell them, because if you say go to see a therapist, they don't always have that prerogative if the parents aren't into it. So I would say as an adult family member, go see a counselor. And sometimes the counselor with the person, you can invite the family members that are the person of interest to the session. I mean, that can blow up in your face. The person can feel ganged up on, but it is one thing that may be tried, may be useful.
Yeah, even if it's a minor, it's so all of us working in this field, we will see this in different contexts. When it's a child, I will oftentimes encourage the child to speak with a school counselor if they are in schools, because that's a way, like, they don't have to get permission to talk to their school counselor. They're already in the context where supports can immediately start being provided. But yeah, that's a really important distinction.
And don't underestimate the power of the Holy Spirit to convict the parent. My dad confessed to his kids on his deathbed that he was not a good parent at times, and it all came out. We didn't have to say a word.
All right, next question. I think this goes for any and all here who's presented. Intimate partner survivor who was left, but still has to interact with the abuser and maybe the abuser's kids. There are those left behind to still interact with the abuser. How do you take and use all this good advice when you're dealing with someone who has narcissistic behavior tendencies? Covert.
Okay. So boundaries are really great, but you can't always have physical boundaries with people. There are times when the situation they're describing, you have to have some kind of physical contact, but it's possible to develop emotional boundaries with narcissistic people. So if it's impossible not to interact with them, then you can create, walls in your heart that don't give them access to you. And the reality is that if you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person for a long stretch of time, you've learned certain behaviors to be able to function and survive in that relationship. And, those are your behaviors. Those things are within your control. The narcissist is not. Focus on what you can change about you, and that'll give you a sense of empowerment. But if you focus on the narcissist, that'll make you feel more helpless. This is one of the reasons I'm not super fond of people making sort of a major focus of narcissism. It's a real thing, and it is harmful. But if people are constantly ruminating and dwelling on the characteristics of a narcissist, they're not really dealing with what they actually have control of, which is themselves, versus the narcissist, because they can't control the narcissist. So.
All right. Thank you. Next question. What if there are two homes and the teen makes a demand about going out, but in your home, your rules are that you do the homework first and go out on the weekend? Don't the other home, the teen, but the other, forgive me. But the other home, the teen has free range. How do you handle the drama that will unfold afterward?
Yeah, I see this a lot in the two homes. Very rarely when there's a two-home situation are the rules exactly the same. And we just can't control that. So it's a lot of, again, boundaries. We're boundary setting, and we explain to the child, you know what, the rules at mom's house might be this, but the rules here are this, and you just have to follow my rules. And I know that it's really confusing and it's not fair to you. But this is the way it is. And if you get to go out on weekdays at your mom's, good job. But here that's not going to happen. And because I love you. Yep. Just those boundaries. And gosh, I wish people would co-parent better. I wish they would go to counseling and just learn how to separate well. But if they could do that, they probably could have stayed together too. So it's a little wishful thinking.
So what's the emphasis then when you're being looked at as a potential bad parent? If you're the parent, what's the emphasis to maybe manage that situation a little bit better?
Yeah, your kid might say they hate you until they're 18, 19, or 20, and that's going to suck for you, to put it bluntly. It's going to hurt that, yep, go to Disney Moms, that's fine, get your ice cream every day of the week and go roller skating and out with your friends and do whatever, and I'll be the heavy. But I'll know that you're safe in my house, and you can go ahead and think you hate me. And it might just be you have to wait until they're an adult for that situation to come full circle. And it's really, really hard to see, and it's really hard to do, but it's when you know what the right thing to do is, do the right thing. Don't bend because you want to be their friend. That is the worst advice ever.
Easy question. How to get a copy of the 10 BCEs?
The internet. And I had it up there. I have the reference on my slide too, so maybe we can post that somewhere or something. Yeah.
Thank you. Two more questions here. How does unresolved trauma impact marriage?
All right. So I do a lot of work with couples, and oftentimes when there's unresolved trauma in a marriage, there's a number of ways that this will show up. One of them is that people can get very uncomfortable with vulnerability. That's probably the easiest way to categorize it, whether it's emotional vulnerability or physical vulnerability. So oftentimes relationships like this, there's usually disagreements about the sexual relationship itself because one person may have had trauma, and that means that their drive can be a lot lower. You can also have situations where, because of their differences, if somebody gets like triggered, you use that word a lot, it can take them days to come down off of something that seems really small or trivial. And so that can create a lot of tension in marriage too. Like you might have just given a look or said something with a certain tone, and then it's like cold shoulder for days. And this will oftentimes occur within that relationship. Oftentimes what is helpful is actually getting to the place where we can slow things down, because one of the things that happens with trauma is responses are rapid, like things happen very quickly. And so if you can actually go back through that process, and let's say somebody does have that kind of trigger moment, if you can slow down and say, okay, what happened for you there? I noticed that like as soon as I said this, you seemed like you got really upset. What's happening? Just be able to talk and explore. And I say just, it's actually quite difficult to do, but it is something that actually helps when you can slow things down and allow the person to, first of all, gain some awareness of what's happening in their own emotions and bodies, and then also know how to respond to each one of those emotions. So a strategy that I use is called emotionally focused therapy. There's books about it. There's one that's called Created for Connection. So we did a little bit of a seminar over there at the Chehalis Church not that long ago. I really recommend checking that out. This is written for Christian couples. There's also the Strategies for Making Marriage Work by John Gottman, and other ones that talk about this. But these are really excellent ways to actually be able to have meaningful conversations that deal with the emotions and deal with the needs that are happening in these conversations that spike up rather rapidly. So those are things that I would kind of recommend. There's probably more details, but that's what I would say. Yeah, so one of the books is called Created for Connection. Created for Connection, and that's by Sue Johnson. And I'm forgetting the other co-author's name. I think the first name is Keith, but I can't remember. But if you put in Sue Johnson, Created for Connection, you will find that book. The other book is 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, and that is by John Gottman and Nan Silver. And you can find that one. That book's pretty accessible. And so it talks about ways that couples can generally work through a myriad of problems outside of just the really tense arguments that can happen if somebody has experienced trauma.
I think a really important, addition to that is that it's really good to have realistic expectations of your marriage. Gottman talks about like something like 69% of marriage problems are perpetual, or conflicts are perpetual. I have found a lot of benefit in seeing it as conflict management versus conflict resolution, because there are things that are just kind of installed in us as individuals, and they're going to come up over and over again, no matter how hard you work on them. And if you can just kind of learn how to be mindful of them and realize that the way that you approach them is more important than getting them to go away. Because if your goal is to make those things go away, it can set you up for feeling like you're failing. And God forbid, like your marriage is failing because you have this baggage that your rocks seem to fit my holes, and then, oh, my marriage is it's fatally flawed. I should just bail out of here because we just can't make this go away. Accepting that there are those dynamics and that they're probably going to, kind of flow throughout the duration of the marriage, but that you can learn how to approach them in a way that draws you together instead of driving you apart, I think is a really important step.
There's a little tidbit. It says the 93% of the time, the way a fight starts is the way it's going to end. So if you start rough, fast, and hard, then don't count on that ending smoothly. So if you want the conversation to end smoothly, then you start it smoothly. Slow starts are an excellent way to make sure we don't get too far down the path.
All right, and readdressing something that was brought up earlier, our last question: how do you prevent trauma when you are married to a narcissist?
Okay. So I'm sure everybody would probably have a little bit of input on this, but what Dr. Schwarzer brought up is, to me, is one of the most excellent things you can do is to make sure that you have effective boundaries. If you have effective boundaries both on the emotional front and on the physical front, you're less likely to be exploited. Oftentimes what drives narcissism is the person is constantly looking for some way to use the other person for their own personal gain. If you refuse to be somebody who can be used in those kind of ways, that is the most effective thing that you can do. And oftentimes narcissists are not stupid, so they recognize right away when somebody is not going to be the person they want them to be. And a lot of times they will exit themselves out of the building as far as like that relationship. They are not interested in people who will not do their bidding. But I try not to just like put people into boxes, because some people could just have narcissistic tendencies. And a lot of times that even goes with like avoidant attachment styles, because people who have avoidant attachment styles will show signs that look like narcissism, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So the other part is just be cautious about how we're labeling people, because like this has become like this huge trend and everybody's a narcissist. Everybody has autism. I have like people come, I think my husband's on the spectrum. It's like, no, it just probably isn't really in touch with his emotions.
He's just a man.
Right. So we just don't want to overdiagnose, but it is a serious thing. But setting the boundaries hands down is like the most effective way that you can begin making some changes there. And I saw one of them up there had the EMDR. So I think somebody had asked a question about EMDR and kind of how that process works. I can't get into a whole bunch of details behind it, but one of the more interesting research that came out recently is when they were doing experiments with mice, they were noticing that when they knocked out a certain gene, it would cause the mice to begin standing up for themselves when they would normally run. And the way you can tell with mice is like whenever they would see a shadow passing overhead, usually they run to a corner, because you've seen this, like when you turn on the light, where does the mouse go? If you have mice in your house, they just right over to the corner. But when they knocked out this particular gene, the mice would start flicking its tail, like saying, like, hey, bring it on, man. Let's do this. And one of the things that was getting activated was a visual center in their brain. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because when people are moving their eyes back and forth like this, it's actually triggering a part of the brain that's telling you that you're approaching a target. And so one of the theories right now is that when people are using like this kind of bilateral stimulation, it's actually telling the body that I'm not going to run from this thing that scares me. I'm going to walk straight to it. I'm facing this thing down. And as soon as you do that, you switch from like that serotonin that we were talking about, that learned helplessness, where the serotonin stuff starts to release in that dorsal rave nuclei, if anybody remembered that. It actually switches on this, what's called the periaqueductal gray, and it puts the person into action mode. They are going to now confront the thing that's going on in front of them. And so that's part of what I believe is really working in EMDR. Other people have other theories about why it works, but I wanted to make sure I at least shared that with anybody who was interested.
That was brilliant. I want to add something about the narcissism situation, and I agree it tends to be over-diagnosed. But I had a friend who her husband got Lyme's disease, and it affected his brain, and he effectively became abusive and narcissistic because of the effect of the disease. And what I told her, she was like capitulating to him and really kind of sacrificing her dignity and conscience to placate this guy. And I said, no, you got to have good boundaries and just say no and mean it, even if he gets mad. And she said, well, he can't help it. And I said, think of it this way. You teach a dog how they can treat you, if they can pee in the house or not. You teach them through, rewards, and you just keep your boundaries and you keep it firm. They eventually learn, and they're a dog. So even a human with a compromised brain, or someone who's a longstanding narcissist with literal, brain damage as a result of living that way for so long, can still learn when you have firm boundaries. But if you cave in, they're going to think if they push you hard enough, they'll get you to cave in. And so you have to be firm. You have to, pick your battles, but you have to win them.
Yeah, no, I've used kind of that question before. Like, does your significant other, do they try to walk through a locked door? And it's like, of course they don't, but that means that they actually have the ability to recognize when a lock actually works, and they have the good sense to realize they got to turn this thing before it works. And it's the same thing with you. You can teach and train people how they're supposed to treat you. As long as you don't give in and you hold your boundaries, they're going to have to do the same thing with you that they do with the door. And if they can learn how to use a doorknob, they can figure out how to treat you, right? So these things can really be actually learned and trained, but your boundaries are that last line of defense.
I would just add one tiny piece to that if I'm still on here. Yeah, one tiny piece to that. Yes, boundaries, 110%. But for people who have been in these relationships for a really, really long time, they'll have the boundary, and then there's a big response because the person is not used to the boundary. And so one piece, I'm borrowing this from somebody else, is for the person setting the boundaries to emotionally divorce themselves from the big response that's about to happen. And it's hard, but it helps keep that boundary because, yep, I said no, and then he got big. Just kidding. You have to emotionally divorce yourself from that big response to keep the boundary.
Thank you. I'm gonna, it's for time's sake, I'm gonna ask that more questions can be addressed to the individuals. There are a lot of people here who don't have questions, and so we want to honor the entire group. But feel free to ask each one of the speakers and communicate with them post-meeting here. They'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. But for now, we're going to have a word of prayer, and we'll close this evening. Heavenly Father, thank you so much. We appreciate the time that we've had. There's a lot of information to process. Some of it's applicable to us. Others may not be directly applicable, but we want to pray today as we wind down our time together formally that we would remember that we have a wonderful counselor and a mighty God and an everlasting Father in you. And we can come to you and cast all our cares upon you because you care for us. And we know that you'll lead us all in ways everlasting. So thank you, Heavenly Father. Help us to use the information that we've been given and blessed with this weekend appropriately. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen. I'd like to thank all the speakers for coming. Thank you all for attending and making it happen. And we look forward to the future when we have more meetings similar. And we'll make sure that the invitation gets extended. Have a blessed evening.